Hi there, my dear friends. My name is Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, born and raised in Cedar Falls, Iowa, back in 1956. Today, I'm going to share something that happened to me just 3 years ago. A story that completely changed how I see family, money, and what really matters in life. What I'm about to tell you might shock you. It's about betrayal from the people I trusted most. Greed that ran so deep it poisoned decades of relationships. And a decision I made that left my entire family speechless. By the end of this story, you'll understand why I chose to give away every single penny of my life savings. All $847,000 to cat shelters across the state, rather than let my own flesh and blood get their hands on it. But this story doesn't start with that dramatic moment. No, it begins much earlier, with a little girl who learned very young that love often comes with conditions, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1956 to Robert and Helen Mitchell in Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street. My father worked at the John Deere plant, and my mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. We weren't rich by any stretch, but we had enough. What we lacked in money, my parents made up for in work ethic and determination. From the time I could walk, I was taught that every penny mattered. My mother would sit me down at the kitchen table with a small glass jar and teach me to count the coins she earned from her sewing. "Maggie," she would say, her weathered hands sorting through quarters and dimes, "money doesn't grow on trees. Every dollar you save today is security for tomorrow." My father was even more direct about it. He'd come home from his shift at the plant, grease still under his fingernails, and he'd look at me with those serious gray eyes. "Margaret Ann Mitchell," he'd say, using my full name when he wanted to make a point. "In this life, nobody's going to take care of you but yourself. You save every penny you can, you work harder than everyone else, and you never ever depend on anyone else for your security." These weren't just words to my parents. They lived by this philosophy every single day. We shopped at thrift stores, grew our own vegetables in a small garden behind the house, and my mother mended our clothes until they literally fell apart. Other kids at school might have had newer things, but I learned to take pride in what we had because it was earned through honest work. When I was 7 years old, something happened that would shape my entire relationship with money for the rest of my life. My father's younger brother, Uncle Tommy, came to stay with us after losing his job in Des Moines. He was supposed to stay for 2 weeks while he got back on his feet. He ended up staying for 8 months. Uncle Tommy was charming, funny, and had a way of making everyone laugh. But he also had sticky fingers and a sense of entitlement that slowly poisoned our household. I remember watching my mother's face grow more strained each week, as grocery bills climbed higher and higher. Uncle Tommy would eat our food, use our electricity to stay up all night watching television, and somehow never quite managed to find that job he was always talking about. The breaking point came when my parents discovered that Uncle Tommy had been going through my mother's sewing earnings, the money she kept in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator for emergencies. He'd taken nearly $60, which might not sound like much now, but in 1963, it represented weeks of my mother's painstaking work. I'll never forget the fight that erupted that night. My father's voice, usually so controlled, shook with fury. "That money wasn't yours, Tommy. That was Helen's hard work. That was our daughter's security." Uncle Tommy's response still echoes in my mind decades later. "Come on, Bob. It's family money. We're all family here. What's the big deal about sharing a little?" Family money. Those 2 words would haunt me for the rest of my life. My father threw Uncle Tommy out that very night, and I watched from my bedroom window as my uncle walked down Maple Street with his single suitcase, muttering about how his own family had turned against him. But what struck me most wasn't Uncle Tommy's departure. It was the lesson my parents taught me afterward. "Maggie," my mother said, sitting on the edge of my bed that night, "you saw what happened here. You saw how someone can take advantage of family kindness. I want you to remember this. Your money is your money. You work for it, you earn it, you save it. Don't ever let anyone tell you that what you've earned belongs to anyone else, even family. My father nodded from the doorway. Families should support each other, but that doesn't mean family gets to take what you've worked for. There's a difference between helping someone and being taken advantage of. From that day forward, I became obsessed with financial independence. While other kids my age were playing with dolls or trading baseball cards, I was finding ways to earn money. I babysat for neighbors, helped elderly Mrs. Peterson with her grocery shopping, and even started a small business selling hand-picked wildflowers to tourists who visited the local park. Every penny I earned went into my own coffee can, hidden in my bedroom closet. I would count it every night before bed, feeling a sense of security that I now realize was probably unusual for a child my age. But after seeing what Uncle Tommy's sense of entitlement had done to our family, I was determined never to be vulnerable like that. In high school, I worked at Morrison's Five and Dime after school and on weekends. While my classmates were going to movies and buying records, I was saving every dollar I could. My parents were proud, but some of my friends thought I was strange. "Why don't you ever buy anything fun?" my friend Susan would ask. "You work all the time, but you never spend any money." I tried to explain it to her once. "My money is my freedom," I said. "As long as I have money saved, I can take care of myself. I don't have to depend on anyone else or worry about someone taking advantage of me." Susan just shrugged, but I could tell she didn't really understand. How could she? She'd never watched her parents' kindness be exploited. She'd never seen how quickly family could turn into entitled to what's yours. When I graduated high school in 1974, I had saved nearly $3,000, an enormous sum for an 18-year-old in those days. My parents were amazed and proud. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Maggie," my father said. "With discipline like that, you'll never have to worry about security." I decided to go to the University of Iowa to study accounting. It seemed like the perfect field for someone who understood the value of money and the importance of careful financial management. My parents couldn't afford to pay for my education, but I didn't expect them to. I had my savings, I qualified for some financial aid, and I was prepared to work my way through college. That's where I met David Richardson in my sophomore year. David was studying engineering, and he came from a family that was quite different from mine. The Richardsons lived in a big house in Iowa City, drove new cars, and seemed to have money for everything they wanted. David's father owned a successful construction company, and money was never something they worried about. At first, I was intimidated by David's background. When he invited me to family dinners, I felt out of place among the expensive furniture and casual talk about vacation plans and investment portfolios. But David was kind, hardworking despite his privileged background, and he seemed genuinely impressed by my financial discipline. "I've never met anyone our age who has their finances so well organized," he told me after I'd reluctantly shared some details about my savings habits. "Most college students are living paycheck to paycheck, but you actually have a plan for your future." What I didn't realize at the time was that David's admiration for my financial discipline was mixed with something else, a sense that my money could benefit his family's lifestyle. The Richardson family had always lived well, but David's father's construction business had some ups and downs, and they were always looking for ways to maintain their standard of living. We dated for 3 years, and during that time I continued my careful saving habits. I worked part-time at a local accounting firm, lived frugally, and added to my savings every month. By the time we graduated in 1978, I had managed to save nearly $15,000, enough for a good down payment on a house or a strong emergency fund. David proposed to me 2 weeks after graduation, and I said yes. I loved him, and I thought I was gaining not just a husband, but a family that would appreciate the financial security I could bring to our marriage. I was so naive. Our wedding was beautiful, held at David's family's church in Iowa City with a reception at the country club where his family were members. I contributed $8,000 to the wedding costs, which seemed fair since I wanted a nice celebration too. But I remember feeling a little uncomfortable when David's mother, Patricia, kept referring to our combined resources as family money. "Now that you're going to be family, dear," she said to me during the wedding planning, "we can all work together to make sure everyone's comfortable. Your savings combined with David's trust fund will give you both such a wonderful start." Trust fund? This was the first I'd heard about any trust fund. When I asked David about it later, he seemed embarrassed. "It's not that much," he said. "Just something my grandfather set up. Maybe $20,000, But Mom's right. Between that and your savings, we'll be in great shape. I should have asked more questions then. I should have insisted on seeing the actual trust fund documents. But I was young and in love, and I trusted that the man I was marrying was being honest with me about our financial situation. After our honeymoon, which cost another $3,000 from my savings, we moved into a small house in Cedar Rapids. David got a job with a local engineering firm, and I was hired by Fletcher and Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm downtown. We both had decent incomes, and I was excited about continuing to build our savings as a married couple. But almost immediately, I noticed that David's approach to money was very different from mine. He seemed to think that my savings account was automatically our money, available for any expense that came up. When he wanted to buy a new car 6 months after we were married, he assumed we'd use money from my savings for the down payment. "It's our money now, honey," he said when I hesitated. "We're married. What's yours is mine and what's mine is yours, right?" I agreed to the car purchase, but something felt wrong about the assumption that my years of careful saving were now available for any expense David thought was worthwhile. I'd been taught that money was security, not something to spend casually on wants rather than needs. The real problem started when David's family began treating my savings as a family resource. When David's younger brother Michael needed money for graduate school, Patricia Richardson called me directly. "Margaret, dear," she said in that sweet voice that I was beginning to recognize as manipulative, "Michael needs about $10,000 for his MBA program. I know you and David have that family money saved up, and this would be such a wonderful investment in Michael's future. Of course he'll pay it back once he's established in his career." Family money. There were those words again, just like Uncle Tommy had used all those years ago. But this time, instead of someone taking my parents' hard-earned savings, it was my own money being redefined as something that belonged to everyone. I told Patricia I needed to discuss it with David, but she'd already talked to him. When I got home that evening, David was full of enthusiasm about helping his brother. "It's a great opportunity for Michael," he said, "and we can afford it. You've always said that money should be used to help family." Had I said that? I couldn't remember ever saying anything like that. What I remembered saying was that family should support each other, but that didn't mean giving away the money you'd worked years to save. But I was young, I was trying to be a good wife and daughter-in-law, and I wanted to fit into this family that seemed so confident and successful. Against my better judgment, I agreed to loan Michael the money. Cap hole, that loan was never repaid. When I asked about it a year later, Michael claimed that his MBA program hadn't led to the high-paying job he'd expected, and David's family acted like I was being petty for even bringing it up. "It's not like you need the money right now," Patricia said, "and Michael is family. Sometimes we all have to make sacrifices for family." But I was the only one making sacrifices. David's family continued to live in their big house, drive their nice cars, and enjoy their comfortable lifestyle. The only person who had actually given up anything was me. That's when I started to understand the pattern that would define the next 40 years of my life. My hard work, my savings, my financial discipline, it was all going to be redefined as family money that belonged to everyone except me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The years following Michael's unpaid loan taught me something disturbing about the Richardson family dynamics. What I had initially mistaken for closeness and generosity was actually a carefully orchestrated system where certain family members contributed while others simply took. And I was rapidly being categorized as a contributor. By 1985, 7 years into our marriage, the requests had become routine. David's sister Jennifer needed money for her wedding, $5,000 that would definitely be paid back within 2 years. David's cousin Robert was starting a restaurant and needed investors. Another $8,000 that was supposed to generate returns, but somehow never did. David's father's construction business hit a rough patch during the recession, and suddenly our family money was needed to help keep the company afloat. Each time, the conversation followed the same pattern. David would come home with that sheepish expression I'd learned to dread, and he'd start with phrases like, "You know how close our family is," or "This is just how families help each other." Then came the request, always framed as temporary, always presented as an opportunity rather than what it really was. A systematic drain on the savings I'd spent years accumulating. What made it worse was how the family had completely rewritten the narrative of our finances. At family gatherings, I would hear Patricia telling other relatives about how David and Margaret have been so generous with their family money. Their family money. As if David had contributed equally to the savings account that I had built almost entirely through my own careful planning and sacrifice. The truth was that David's mysterious trust fund had turned out to be mostly smoke and mirrors. The $20,000 he'd mentioned had been largely depleted years before we even met, spent on his college expenses and a car his parents had bought him. But somehow this fact never seemed relevant when the family needed funds. It was always David and Margaret's money that was available, never Margaret's money that David hadn't contributed to. I tried talking to David about establishing boundaries, but he seemed genuinely confused by my concerns. "Maggie, they're family," he would say, as if that explained everything. "When you marry someone, you marry their family. This is just how the Richardsons operate. We look out for each other." But the looking out only seemed to go in one direction. When I mentioned that we should start saving for our own house, our own retirement, maybe children someday, David would agree in principle, but then another family emergency would arise. His brother needed bail money after a DUI. His cousin's business was struggling and needed another infusion of cash. His parents' roof needed repair and their homeowner's insurance had lapsed. By 1987, our savings account, my savings account, really, had dwindled from over $15,000 to less than $3,000. I was working full-time as a senior accountant, earning good money. But every dollar I managed to save seemed to disappear into the Richardson family's endless pit of needs and wants. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my financial future. I opened a secret savings account. I know how that sounds. I know that financial secrecy in a marriage is generally considered a red flag. But I was desperate to rebuild some security for myself, and it had become clear that any money David knew about would eventually become available to his family's latest crisis. I started small, redirecting $50 from each paycheck into an account at a different bank across town. I told myself it was just temporary, just until I could figure out how to have a serious conversation with David about boundaries. But as the months passed and the family requests continued, my secret account became my lifeline. I became incredibly creative about building this hidden nest egg. When I got a raise at work, I told David it was smaller than it actually was, and banked the difference. When I did freelance accounting work on weekends, I would report only half the income and save the rest. I started couponing obsessively, not to save money on groceries, but to have extra cash to deposit in my secret account. The guilt was enormous. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I was being paranoid or selfish. Maybe David was right. Maybe this was just how families worked, and I was being too rigid in my thinking about money. After all, the Richardsons seemed happy with their system. They genuinely appeared to love and support each other, even if that support was largely financial and flowing in one direction. But then came the incident that convinced me I was right to protect my savings. In early 1988, David's brother Michael, the same one who had never repaid his MBA loan, called with another emergency. He'd been laid off from his job and was facing foreclosure on his house. He needed $15,000 immediately to catch up on his mortgage payments and buy some time to find new employment. "Maggie," David said that evening, "I know we've helped Michael before, but this is different. He could lose his house. He could end up homeless. And you know Sarah is pregnant with their first child." Sarah was Michael's wife, a sweet woman who had always been kind to me. The thought of her and her unborn baby facing homelessness was genuinely distressing. But $15,000? We didn't have $15,000. Our joint account had maybe $4,000 at that point. "David, we can't afford that kind of money," I said. "We barely have any savings left ourselves." That's when David said something that chilled me to the bone. "Well, I know you've been working a lot of overtime lately, and you've been so good about managing our budget. I figured you probably had some money tucked away somewhere for emergencies. This seems like an emergency." He knew. Somehow, he had figured out that I had money he didn't know about. Maybe he'd noticed discrepancies in my reported income. Maybe he'd seen me making deposits at the other bank. Or maybe he'd just assumed that someone as financially careful as me would have hidden savings. Kiakin knew making Tories. I felt trapped. If I admitted to having secret savings, I would have to explain why I'd hidden money from my husband. If I denied it, I'd be lying directly to his face. Either way, I could see that my carefully protected nest egg was about to become another casualty of Richardson family needs. "I have some money saved," I admitted reluctantly. "But David, it's money I've been saving for us. For our future. For a house down payment or retirement or—" I trailed off, seeing the expression on his face. "How much?" he asked. I had almost $12,000 in my secret account at that point. It represented 3 years of careful saving, sacrifice, and creativity. It was my security blanket, my insurance policy against financial vulnerability. "It's not 15,000, I said, which was technically true. "But it's something, right? Even if we can only give Michael 10,000, that would help him negotiate with the bank. Maybe buy him a few more months." I found myself in an impossible position. Michael and Sarah genuinely needed help. David's family would be watching to see how generous I was willing to be. And David himself seemed to view my secret savings as a resource that naturally belonged to the family's collective needs. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Uncle Tommy and that coffee can on top of my parents' refrigerator. I thought about my mother's words, "Your money is your money." I thought about my father's advice about never depending on others for security. But I also thought about Sarah, 7 months pregnant, potentially losing her home. I thought about how this family had welcomed me, even if their version of welcome came with financial expectations. I thought about the marriage I was trying to build, and the man I loved, even when I didn't understand his family's approach to money. The next morning, I withdrew $10,000 from my secret account and gave it to David for Michael. I told myself it was the right thing to do, the compassionate thing to do. I told myself that Michael would surely pay it back this time, especially with the baby coming. I was wrong, of course. Michael never paid back a penny of that money. When I asked about it 6 months later, David looked genuinely surprised that I expected repayment. "Maggie, that was a gift," he said. "Michael was about to lose his house. We couldn't expect him to pay back money that saved him from homelessness." A gift. My 3 years of secret saving, my carefully hoarded security, had become a gift to someone who had already taken thousands of dollars from us and never returned it. That's when I realized I needed to make some fundamental changes in my approach. The Richardson family system was never going to change. They would continue to have crises, continue to need money, and continue to view my earnings as a family resource. If I wanted any financial security, I was going to have to get much better at protecting it. I started by changing jobs. In 1989, I left Fletcher & Associates and took a position with a larger firm in Des Moines. The commute was longer, but the salary was significantly higher. More importantly, it gave me distance from David's family and their constant awareness of our financial situation. I also started being much more strategic about my hidden savings. Instead of one secret account, I opened several, spreading money across different banks and even different cities. I started a retirement account that David didn't know about. I bought savings bonds that I kept in a safe deposit box. I even started keeping some cash hidden in various places around our house. Assess. This wasn't just about hiding money anymore. This was about survival. I could see that the Richardson family's financial needs were never going to end, and I could see that David was never going to prioritize our household's financial security over his family's immediate wants. If I didn't protect our future, no one would. By 1992, I had managed to rebuild my hidden savings to over $20,000, despite the family's continued requests for loans and gifts. I had learned to be vague about my income, creative about my expenses, and firm about what we could and couldn't afford from our joint accounts. But I was also becoming a different person, more secretive, more guarded, more calculating about every financial decision. The spontaneous, trusting young woman who had fallen in love with David was being replaced by someone who viewed every family gathering as a potential threat to her financial security. The worst part was that I was starting to resent the very people I was supposed to love. Every time Patricia mentioned another family member's financial needs, I felt my jaw clench. Every time David spoke admiringly about his family's generosity, I wanted to scream that it wasn't generosity when it was always the same person paying. I was building my own financial fortress, but I was doing it in isolation, surrounded by people who would never understand why I felt the need to protect myself from their love. The 1990s brought what I now recognize as the consolidation phase of my double life. On the surface, I was Margaret Richardson, devoted wife and family member, always ready to contribute to the family's collective needs. Underneath, I was someone else entirely, a woman methodically building financial walls that would protect her future from the very people she shared dinner with every Sunday. The catalyst for my most dramatic escalation in financial secrecy came in 1994, when David's father, William Richardson, suffered a major heart attack. At 62, he was forced to retire from his construction business, and the family suddenly faced the reality that their primary income source was gone. The business had debts, the equipment needed to be sold, and William's medical bills were mounting despite insurance coverage. I should have seen what was coming. During the family meeting at the Richardson house, a gathering I remember with crystal clarity because it marked such a turning point in my life, Patricia laid out their financial situation with remarkable candor. The medical bills would total at least $40,000 over the next year. The business closure was going to cost another $60,000 in outstanding debts and equipment sales at a loss. William's early retirement meant no pension for another 3 years. "We need to think creatively about resources," Patricia said, looking around the room at her assembled children and their spouses. "This family has always pulled together during difficult times, and we're going to get through this too." Jennifer's husband Mark cleared his throat. "Mom, we're still paying off Jenny's student loans. We can't really contribute much financially right now." Michael nodded in agreement. "With the new baby and Sarah only working part-time, we're barely making our own mortgage payments." One by one, every family member explained why they couldn't help significantly with the financial crisis. Everyone, that is, except David and me. As I sat in that living room, surrounded by expensive furniture that would soon need to be sold, I realized that once again, the family's solution to their problems was going to involve my savings. David, bless his heart, tried to be diplomatic. "Maggie and I will need to look at our finances and see what we can do," he said. "We can't promise anything specific, but we'll figure out how to help." What David didn't know was that by 1994, my hidden financial world had become quite sophisticated. I had 7 different savings accounts across 3 banks, a retirement fund that was growing steadily, and approximately $45,000 in various investments and cash holdings that he knew nothing about. I had also started doing significant freelance accounting work, building a client base that generated income I could control entirely. That night, David approached the conversation exactly as I had expected he would. "Maggie, I know this is a lot to ask, but my parents really need our help. Dad's heart attack scared everyone, and Mom's beside herself about the money." "How much are they thinking we could contribute?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Well, if we could cover the medical bills, that would be huge. Maybe 40,000? I know it sounds like a lot, but think about everything my parents have done for us over the years. Everything they had done for us." I mentally cataloged what that might include. Letting us have our wedding reception at their country club, which I had paid for. Hosting family dinners, where I always brought expensive wine and desserts. Giving us David's childhood bedroom furniture, which was worn out and had been replaced with newer pieces for their guest room. The generosity seemed to flow predominantly in one direction, and it wasn't toward us. But William Richardson was genuinely sick, and despite my growing resentment of the family's financial patterns, I wasn't heartless. A man's health and dignity were at stake. So I agreed to contribute $25,000, a significant portion of my hidden savings, but not enough to devastate my financial security entirely. What happened next taught me something crucial about family dynamics and money. The $25,000 I contributed was received with gratitude, certainly, but it was also immediately absorbed into the family's expectation framework. Within 6 months, the crisis had passed, William's health had stabilized, and life had returned to normal. But the family's perception of David and me as the financially stable ones who could handle emergencies had solidified permanently. We became the family bank. Not officially, not with any formal arrangement or even explicit acknowledgement of the role, but whenever anyone in the Richardson family faced a financial challenge over the following years, the assumption was that we would help solve it. David's nephew needed money for college. David's niece wanted to buy her first car. Patricia decided the house needed new appliances. Michael's wife, Sarah, wanted to go back to school for nursing. Jennifer and Mark were thinking about starting a family but needed to renovate their house first. The requests came regularly, predictably, and always with the same underlying assumption. David and Margaret had money, therefore David and Margaret should share. What made this particularly frustrating was how the family had developed a narrative that made their requests seem reasonable, and my reluctance seem selfish. They would talk about how lucky David and I were to both have good jobs and no children. They would mention how smart I was with money, as if my financial discipline was a natural talent rather than years of hard work and sacrifice. They would reference how generous we had always been, creating a precedent that made future generosity seem obligatory. By the late 1990s, I estimate that we had given or loaned approximately $80,000 to various Richardson family members over the course of our marriage. None of the loans had been repaid. Most of the gifts had been taken for granted within months of being given. And somehow, our financial contributions had become so normalized that family members would mention needing money in casual conversation, as if we were an ATM rather than relatives with our own financial goals and concerns. The psychological toll of this situation was enormous. I felt like I was living two completely different lives. In my professional world, I was respected for my financial expertise and conservative approach to money management. Clients valued my advice about protecting assets and planning for long-term security. I was known as someone who understood the importance of boundaries and careful resource allocation. But in my family life, I was expected to ignore every principle I believed in about financial management. I was supposed to give money freely without expecting repayment, to prioritize other people's wants over my own needs, and to treat my hard-earned savings as a community resource rather than personal security. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I would spend my days advising clients about the importance of emergency funds and retirement planning, then come home to requests that I drain my own emergency funds to pay for someone else's non-essential expenses. I would lecture clients about enabling financially irresponsible behavior, then write checks to family members who had made poor financial decisions repeatedly. In 1999, something happened that crystallized just how skewed the family's expectations had become. David's brother Michael, now in his 30s with 2 children, decided he wanted to start his own landscaping business. He had no experience in landscaping, no business plan, and no capital of his own. But he had an idea and an assumption that the family would support his entrepreneurial dreams. The request this time was for $50,000, more money than I had ever given to anyone for any reason. When David presented this to me, he seemed genuinely confused by my immediate negative reaction. "Maggie, this isn't like the other times," he said. "This is an investment in Michael's future. He'll pay us back with interest once the business gets profitable." I looked at my husband, this man I had loved for over 20 years, and realized that he had completely lost sight of financial reality. Michael had never repaid a single loan. He had never successfully completed any business venture or financial commitment. He had a track record of exactly 0 when it came to fiscal responsibility. Yet David was suggesting we give him an amount of money that represented years of my careful saving. "David," I said carefully, "Michael has borrowed money from us at least 6 times over the past 15 years. He has never repaid any of it. What makes you think this time will be different?" "Because this time it's his own business," David replied. "He'll be motivated to succeed because his family's livelihood depends on it." The logic was so flawed that I didn't even know where to begin. Michael's family's livelihood had depended on his success many times before, and that motivation had never translated into financial responsibility or loan repayment. But pointing this out to David would mean acknowledging the pattern of enabling that had defined our marriage, and I wasn't sure our relationship could survive that level of honesty. I refused to give Michael the $50,000. This was the first time I had explicitly said no to a family financial request, and the reaction was swift and dramatic. Suddenly, I was the selfish one. I was the one who didn't understand family loyalty. I was the one who was being unreasonable and ungenerous. Patricia actually called me directly to express her disappointment. "Margaret, dear," she said in that tone I had learned to hate, I'm surprised by your attitude about Michael's business opportunity. Your family has always been so supportive of each other's dreams. Your family. After 21 years of marriage, after contributing tens of thousands of dollars to Richardson family needs, I was still your family when it came to obligations, but apparently not our family when it came to consideration or respect. That phone call marked the beginning of the end of my attempts to be the generous daughter-in-law. I realized that no amount of financial contribution would ever make me a true insider in this family. I would always be the outsider whose resources were available for the family's use, but whose own needs and concerns were secondary to everyone else's. I also realized that David would never understand my perspective on this issue. He had grown up in a family where money flowed freely from whoever had it to whoever needed it, and he genuinely couldn't comprehend why I would want to hoard resources instead of sharing them generously. To him, my careful financial planning looked like selfishness. To me, his family's constant requests looked like exploitation. From 2000 onward, I implemented what I privately called my financial fortress strategy. I became extremely secretive about my income, my savings, and my financial planning. I started telling David that my salary was lower than it actually was. I began keeping significant amounts of cash in safe deposit boxes that he didn't know existed. I opened retirement accounts at institutions where he had never banked. Most importantly, I started building my exit strategy. Not because I wanted to leave David, but because I needed to know that I could survive financially if the family's financial demands ever became truly unsustainable. I needed to know that I had enough money hidden away to maintain my independence no matter what happened. This period of my life was characterized by constant vigilance and careful calculation. Every dollar I earned had to be accounted for in terms of what David knew about it and what I could safely hide. Every family gathering became an exercise in deflecting conversations about money while gathering intelligence about who might need financial help next. I became someone I had never intended to be, secretive, calculating, and perpetually defensive about money. But I also became someone who was truly financially secure for the first time since my marriage. By 2005, I had accumulated over $200,000 in assets that David knew nothing about. I had created a financial foundation that could weather any family crisis without leaving me vulnerable. What I hadn't anticipated was how this financial security would change my perspective on everything else in my life. When you no longer fear being financially exploited, you start to see exploitation attempts much more clearly. And what I started to see in the Richardson family dynamics was going to shock me more than I ever imagined possible. The discovery that would shatter my entire understanding of my marriage came, ironically, through my professional expertise. In 2006, I was promoted to senior partner at Morrison, Klein & Associates, the accounting firm where I had worked for 7 years. With this promotion came access to more sophisticated financial investigation tools and databases, resources that I would never have thought to use on my own family if not for a seemingly innocent request from David. It was a Tuesday evening in March when David came home with what appeared to be a straightforward favor to ask. His cousin Robert, the same one whose restaurant had failed after we invested $8,000 in it, was applying for a business loan to start a new venture. The bank required character references from family members, and specifically wanted financial professionals to vouch for Robert's reliability and fiscal responsibility. "Would you mind writing a letter of recommendation for Robert?" David asked. "You know, something professional that mentions your accounting background and your confidence in his business sense?" I stared at my husband in disbelief. Robert had lost every penny of our previous investment. His restaurant had failed within 18 months, largely due to poor financial management, and what I suspected was some creative accounting with the till money. The idea of vouching for his financial reliability was absurd. "David, I can't possibly recommend Robert for a business loan," I said. "He still owes us money from the restaurant, and that business failed because of financial mismanagement." "But that wasn't really his fault," David protested. "The location was bad, and the economy was tough. He's learned from his mistakes." This conversation troubled me enough that I decided to do something I had never done before. I used my professional resources to investigate Robert's actual financial history. What I found disturbed me more than I had anticipated. Robert hadn't just failed with one business. Over the past 15 years, he had started and failed with 4 different ventures, each time leaving significant debts unpaid. He had declared bankruptcy twice. He had multiple judgments against him for unpaid loans and contractor services. Most shocking of all, he was currently being sued by 3 different investors for what appeared to be fraudulent misrepresentation of his previous business experience. But what really alarmed me was what I discovered when I started looking deeper into the Richardson family's financial history. Using the same databases and investigation tools, I began uncovering information that painted a very different picture of the family I had been supporting for nearly 3 decades. Michael, whose education loans and mortgage payments we had supported repeatedly, owned rental properties in 3 different states that he had never mentioned to the family. Properties that generated significant monthly income. Properties that he had purchased using loans that listed his income as substantially higher than what he had ever claimed when asking us for money. Jennifer, who was always claiming financial hardship and requesting help with her children's expenses, had inherited a substantial trust fund from her maternal grandmother in 1998, a trust fund worth over $100,000 that she had apparently never mentioned to anyone in the family. David's parents, William and Patricia, were not the financially struggling retirees they had portrayed themselves to be. William's construction business had been sold for far more than the family had been told, and the proceeds had been invested in a diversified portfolio that was generating comfortable retirement income. The medical bills from William's heart attack had been largely covered by a supplemental insurance policy that no one had mentioned during the family crisis. But the discovery that truly devastated me was what I found in David's own financial background. Remember that trust fund he had mentioned when we were engaged? The one he claimed was worth about $20,000? According to the estate records I accessed, David's grandfather had actually left him a trust fund worth $250,000, with additional provisions that had grown the fund to over $400,000 by the time we married. $400,000. David had been a wealthy man when we married, wealthier than I had ever been, even after years of careful saving. Yet he had allowed me to fund our entire lifestyle, our family's emergencies, and everyone else's financial needs, while sitting on a fortune that could have covered every expense we had ever encountered. I sat in my office that evening, staring at the computer screen that displayed the evidence of my husband's secret wealth, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. Not only had David failed to contribute to our family's financial security, but he had actively concealed his ability to contribute while watching me sacrifice my own savings again and again. The next few weeks were a blur of additional research and increasingly horrifying discoveries. The Richardson family's financial picture was completely different from what had been presented to me. Not only were they not the struggling, mutually supportive family they portrayed themselves to be, but several of them were significantly wealthier than David and I appeared to be based on our apparent income. Michael's rental properties were generating enough income to easily repay every loan we had ever given him. Jennifer's trust fund could have covered her children's education expenses 10 times over. William and Patricia's investment portfolio was substantial enough that they could have handled William's medical bills without any family assistance whatsoever. Most devastatingly, David's trust fund meant that he could have been contributing equally to every family financial crisis, instead of expecting me to carry the burden alone. He could have funded his brother's education, his sister's wedding, his cousin's failed businesses, and his parents' emergencies without touching a penny of my savings or income. I had been played. For nearly 30 years, I had been systematically manipulated by a family that presented themselves as financially vulnerable, while concealing wealth that dwarfed my own careful savings. They had allowed me to sacrifice my financial security to support their lifestyle, while sitting on resources that made my contributions unnecessary. But the manipulation went even deeper than concealed wealth. As I continued my investigation, I discovered that the Richardson family had been coordinating their requests for money from us. There were email chains between Patricia and her children discussing the timing of requests, the amounts that would be reasonable to ask for, and strategies for making the requests seem urgent and necessary. In one email from Patricia to Jennifer, dated just 2 months before Jennifer's request for wedding money, Patricia wrote, "Wait until after Michael asks for his mortgage help before you mention the wedding expenses. We don't want Margaret to feel overwhelmed by too many requests at once. And remember to emphasize how temporary the loan will be." They had been treating me like a mark in a confidence game. Every request had been calculated. Every crisis had been staged for maximum emotional impact, and every expression of gratitude had been designed to keep me compliant and generous. I found emails discussing my personality, my financial habits, and my emotional vulnerabilities. Michael had written to David, "Margaret really responds to the family loyalty angle. If you emphasize how much this means to the family's reputation, she'll come around." Jennifer had advised Patricia, "Don't mention our savings when you ask Margaret for money. She gets weird about people having money but still asking for help." They knew exactly how to manipulate me, and they had been doing it consciously and deliberately for decades. But perhaps the most painful discovery was David's role in this deception. He wasn't just a passive participant who went along with his family's requests. He was an active collaborator who helped plan and execute the manipulation of his own wife. In emails to his brother, David discussed my secret savings, money he had known about all along but pretended to discover when it was convenient. He wrote about my paranoia about money and my need to control our finances, describing my careful financial planning as character flaws rather than responsible behavior. Most shockingly, David had been reporting details about our financial situation to his family throughout our marriage. My salary, our account balances, my investment strategies. Information I thought was private between husband and wife had been shared with his entire family to help them calibrate their requests for money. In one email to Patricia, David wrote, "Margaret's been doing really well with her freelance work this year. She's probably saved about $15,000 more than she's told me about. If you need money for the house repairs, now would be a good time to ask." My own husband had been spying on my finances and reporting to his family about my hidden savings. Savings I had hidden specifically to protect myself from their financial demands. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I couldn't process it all at once. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, respect, and the fundamental honesty that should exist between spouses. David had been lying to me about his wealth while conspiring with his family to extract money from me based on fabricated crises and emotional manipulation. I realized that I had never actually known my husband at all. The man I thought I had married, someone who came from a family that struggled financially but supported each other emotionally, didn't exist. Instead, I had married someone who came from a wealthy family that had decided to use me as their personal ATM while concealing their ability to fund their own lifestyle. Every memory of our marriage was tainted by this new knowledge. Every family gathering where I had felt guilty for not contributing more. Every time I had forced myself to be generous when I wanted to save money. Every sacrifice I had made for people who didn't need my sacrifice but had convinced me they did. I thought about all the things David and I had postponed because we couldn't afford them. We had never taken expensive vacations because we were always contributing to family emergencies. We had never bought a house because our savings kept getting depleted by family loans. We had never had children because we couldn't feel financially secure enough to take on that responsibility. Meanwhile, David had been sitting on enough money to fund all of those dreams while watching me sacrifice them to support his family's manufactured crises. The scope of the deception was so vast that I couldn't see a way forward in my marriage. How do you confront a betrayal that encompasses every major financial decision you've made for 30 years? How do you rebuild trust with someone who has been systematically lying to you about the most fundamental aspects of your shared life? But even more than the betrayal, I felt a rage that I had never experienced before in my life. Not just anger at David, but fury at myself for being so naive. I was a professional accountant. I was someone who investigated financial fraud for a living. How had I allowed myself to be deceived so completely by people I trusted? The answer, I realized, was that I had wanted to believe in the narrative they had sold me. I had wanted to believe that I was part of a close, supportive family. I had wanted to believe that my financial contributions mattered and were appreciated. I had wanted to believe that my husband was honest, and that our marriage was built on mutual respect and shared goals. But none of that had been true. I had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy, funded by my own money and sustained by my own willingness to be deceived. Now I faced the most important decision of my adult life: what to do with this knowledge that had shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and myself. The knowledge of my family's deception sat inside me like a poison for 3 months before I decided what to do about it. During those months, I continued my normal routine: going to work, attending family dinners, participating in the endless cycle of Richardson family life, while internally planning what would become the most carefully orchestrated response to betrayal I could imagine. The hardest part was pretending that nothing had changed. Sitting across from David at breakfast, listening to him complain about work stress while knowing he had hundreds of thousands of dollars he'd never told me about. Watching Patricia fuss over the cost of groceries while knowing she was sitting on substantial investment returns. Hearing Michael talk about his financial struggles while he collected rental income from properties I'd helped him afford to purchase. Every family gathering became an exercise in anthropological observation. I would watch these people who had been lying to me for decades, studying their techniques, marveling at their audacity. They had created such an elaborate theater of financial vulnerability that they had convinced themselves it was real. At the Easter dinner in 2006, just weeks after my discoveries, Patricia actually complained about the cost of the ham she had served. $34 for a ham, she said, shaking her head. I remember when you could get a nice ham for $8 or $9. I sat there, knowing that her investment portfolio had earned more in dividends that day than she had spent on the entire Easter meal, and watched her perform this elaborate pantomime of financial hardship for the family's benefit. But the performance wasn't really for the family, it was for me. They needed me to continue believing that they were struggling, so that I would continue being available as their financial safety net. Ahas. The psychology of it fascinated me. These people had convinced themselves that their wealth didn't count because it was invested or inherited rather than earned through current labor. David's trust fund wasn't real money in his mind because he hadn't worked for it. Patricia and William's investments weren't available resources because they were designated for retirement, even though they were already retired and using the income. Michael's rental properties were business assets, not personal wealth, even though the income was paying for his family's lifestyle. They had created elaborate mental categories that allowed them to maintain significant wealth while still feeling justified in requesting money from me. It was a masterpiece of psychological compartmentalization that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so destructive to my life. But while I was studying their behavior, I was also planning my response. The accounting skills that had allowed me to discover their deception also gave me the tools to plan something far more sophisticated than simply confronting them or leaving David. I was going to execute a plan that would expose their manipulation while ensuring they could never take advantage of me again. First, I needed to secure my own financial position completely. Over the summer of 2006, I accelerated my secret savings strategy. I took on additional consulting clients, worked overtime whenever possible, and found new ways to increase my income without David's knowledge. I also began systematically moving money from our joint accounts into my private savings, taking amounts small enough that David wouldn't notice but large enough to make a significant difference over time. By September 2006, I had accumulated over $300,000 in assets that David and his family knew nothing about. But more importantly, I had documentation of every financial transaction between our household and the Richardson family over the past 20 years. Every loan, every gift, every emergency contribution, I had records of all of it. I also began gathering evidence of the family's actual financial situation. Tax returns that David had left lying around, bank statements I glimpsed when visiting their homes, property records I could access through my professional resources. I was building a comprehensive picture of their real wealth that I could use when the time came to expose their deception. The next phase of my plan involved what I privately called controlled experiments. I wanted to test whether the family's financial requests were genuinely based on need or simply on opportunity and habit. So I began manipulating the information they had access to about our financial situation. I started telling David that business was slower at the accounting firm, that my freelance clients were cutting back, that our own finances were tighter than usual. I wanted to see if the family's requests for money would decrease if they believed we had less available to give. The results were illuminating. When I mentioned that I was concerned about our own financial security, the family requests didn't stop. They just became more emotionally manipulative. Instead of asking for money for discretionary expenses, they started manufacturing crises that would be harder for me to refuse. Suddenly, Michael's car needed emergency repairs that couldn't wait. Jennifer's daughter needed money for a school trip that was supposedly a once-in-a-lifetime educational opportunity. Patricia discovered a leak in their roof that had to be fixed immediately before it caused structural damage. None of these crises were real, of course. I was able to verify through various means that Michael's car was fine, Jennifer's daughter's school trip was optional and months away, and Patricia's roof had been recently inspected and found to be in excellent condition. The family was manufacturing emergencies to justify continued requests for money from what they perceived to be our dwindling resources. Rather than scaling back their expectations when they thought we were struggling, they were escalating their manipulation to ensure they could continue extracting money from us. This experiment confirmed what I had suspected. The Richardson family's relationship with me was purely financial. They weren't asking for money because they needed it. They were asking for money because they wanted it, and because they had always been able to get it from me. The final element of my plan involved what would happen to the money they had taken from me over the years. I couldn't get back the money that had already been spent, but I could ensure that any future wealth I accumulated would never be available to them again. And I could make sure that my eventual estate would reflect my true feelings about their treatment of me. That's when I started thinking seriously about cats. I had always been fond of animals, but David was allergic, so we had never been able to have pets. Over the years, I had occasionally volunteered at the Cedar Falls animal shelter, helping with their financial records and bookkeeping. I had seen firsthand how difficult it was for animal shelters to maintain adequate funding, and how many animals suffered because of limited resources. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Here were organizations doing genuinely valuable work, always struggling financially, never manipulating anyone or manufacturing crises to extract donations. The contrast with the Richardson family couldn't have been more stark. I began volunteering more regularly at animal shelters across the state, learning about their operations and their needs. I discovered that there were dozens of cat rescue organizations operating on minimal budgets, often run by volunteers, who used their own money to fund veterinary care, food, and shelter for abandoned animals. These organizations embodied everything the Richardson family pretended to be but wasn't. They were genuinely struggling financially. They used every donated dollar for its intended purpose. They were transparent about their needs and grateful for any help they received. Most importantly, they were actually helping vulnerable creatures who couldn't help themselves. The irony was perfect. While David's family had been pretending to be financially vulnerable in order to exploit my generosity, there were actual vulnerable creatures who genuinely needed help and would use any assistance purely for survival and care, rather than lifestyle enhancement. By the end of 2006, I had made my decision. I was going to execute what I thought of as my financial independence plan. I would continue accumulating wealth while allowing David and his family to believe that our financial situation was becoming more precarious. When the time was right, I would reveal their deception while simultaneously announcing that every penny of my money would eventually go to cat shelters, rather than to any member of the Richardson family. But first, I needed to test the limits of their manipulation one more time. I needed to create a situation that would expose just how far they were willing to go to extract money from me, and I needed to document their response in a way that would justify my ultimate decision. The opportunity came in early 2007, when I decided to tell the family that I was considering early retirement. This was actually true. My secret savings had grown large enough that I could afford to retire comfortably if I wanted to, but I presented it as a financial challenge rather than a financial opportunity. "I'm thinking about retiring in a few years," I mentioned casually at a family dinner, "but it means we're going to have to be really careful about our finances. I'll need to make sure every penny we have is preserved for our retirement security." The response was immediate and predictable. Suddenly, every member of the Richardson family had urgent financial needs that simply couldn't wait for my retirement. Patricia needed money for a new car because her old one was unsafe. Michael's rental properties needed emergency repairs that had to be done immediately. Jennifer's children needed money for summer camps that would shape their entire future. David, rather than supporting his wife's retirement planning, actively lobbied for me to delay retirement, so that we could continue being available for family financial emergencies. Maybe this isn't the best time to think about retiring, he said. The family is going through a lot of challenges right now, and they really depend on our stability. Our stability? The family depended on our financial contributions, not our emotional support or our presence in their lives. David was asking me to delay my own retirement so that I could continue funding his family's lifestyle while they sat on their own substantial assets. That conversation clinched my decision completely. I was dealing with people who would sacrifice my financial security and my future happiness to maintain their access to my money. They weren't just lying about their wealth. They were actively working to keep me trapped in a financial relationship that benefited only them. I spent the spring of 2007 putting the final elements of my plan into place. I opened additional savings accounts, moved more money out of any account David had access to, and began establishing relationships with cat rescue organizations across Iowa and neighboring states. I also started working with an estate planning attorney to ensure that my wishes would be carried out exactly as I intended. By summer 2007, I was ready to execute the most satisfying financial decision of my entire life. But I wanted to time it perfectly. And I wanted to make sure that when I revealed the truth about their wealth and my response to their deception, they would understand exactly what they had lost through their years of manipulation and betrayal. The opportunity would come sooner than I expected, and it would be even more dramatic than I had planned. The catalyst for my final confrontation with the Richardson family came in October 2007, in the form of what would become known as the inheritance crisis. David's great-aunt Mildred, a woman I had met perhaps 3 times in 30 years of marriage, passed away at the age of 91. What happened next would provide me with the perfect opportunity to expose everything I had discovered about my husband's family. Great-aunt Mildred had been something of a family legend, a spinster who had lived frugally in the same small house for 60 years, never married, never had children, and according to family lore, never spent money on anything unnecessary. The family had always assumed she was living on Social Security and a small pension, scraping by in genteel poverty. So when her will was read and revealed that she had left an estate worth over $400,000, the Richardson family was shocked. But what really sent them into a frenzy was the discovery that she had left the entire amount to be divided equally among her great-nieces and great-nephews, which included David, Michael, and Jennifer. David's share of the inheritance was going to be approximately $130,000. Combined with his secret trust fund, this meant my husband would soon have access to over $500,000 in assets that he had never told me about. But here's where the story gets truly incredible. Instead of seeing this windfall as an opportunity to finally contribute to the family's financial needs himself, David immediately began discussing how we could use our inheritance money to help other family members who hadn't been included in Aunt Mildred's will. It feels weird that Aunt Mildred only left money to the great-nieces and nephews, David said the evening after the will reading. What about my parents? They took care of her when she was sick. And what about my cousins who aren't in our generation? It doesn't seem fair. I stared at my husband in amazement. He was about to receive a 6-figure inheritance on top of the trust fund he'd been hiding from me for 30 years, and his first instinct was to figure out how to give it away to family members, using the same fairness arguments that had been used to justify taking my money for decades. David, I said carefully, this is your inheritance. Aunt Mildred made her decisions about how to distribute her money. Maybe you should think about what you want to do with your own share. But that's just it, he replied. It doesn't feel right to keep money that other family members could really use. I mean, look at Mom and Dad. They've been struggling since Dad's retirement. And Michael is still trying to get his landscaping business off the ground. This money could really make a difference for them. The audacity was breathtaking. David was planning to give away his inheritance to family members who were secretly wealthy, while continuing to expect me to fund our own household expenses and any future family emergencies from my income and savings. But what happened next was even more revealing. Within a week of the will reading, I started receiving phone calls from various Richardson family members, each offering their perspective on how David's inheritance should be distributed. Patricia called first. Margaret, dear, I hope David will consider how this inheritance could help the whole family. His father and I have been so worried about finances, and this money could really ease our stress about retirement. Michael called next. Maggie, I've been thinking about David's inheritance, and it occurs to me that this could be a great opportunity for him to invest in my landscaping business. I could really use about $50,000 to expand the operation, and David would be helping family while making a smart investment. Jennifer called last. Margaret, I hope you'll encourage David to think about the children's future. This inheritance money could go such a long way toward college funds for the kids. It would be such a wonderful legacy from Aunt Mildred. Notice that none of them called David directly to discuss his inheritance. They all called me, because they had learned over the years that I was the one who actually made financial decisions in our household. They knew that David might agree to their requests in principle, but I was the one who would need to write the checks. What they didn't know was that I had spent the past year documenting their real financial situations and preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. I had evidence of Patricia and William's investment portfolio, proof of Michael's rental property income, and documentation of Jennifer's trust fund. I knew that none of them needed David's inheritance money, but all of them wanted it. Pukabun. This was my moment. I had been waiting for an opportunity to reveal everything I had discovered, and the inheritance situation provided the perfect context. The family was about to be exposed to additional wealth, but instead of feeling secure, they were scheming to extract even more money from us. It was the ultimate illustration of their greed and manipulation. I decided to set a trap. Instead of confronting David immediately about the inheritance situation, I told him I thought his impulse to help family was admirable, but that we should approach it systematically. I suggested that we gather detailed financial information from each family member who might need help, so we could make informed decisions about how to distribute his inheritance most effectively. That's a great idea, David said enthusiastically. We should really understand everyone's situation before we decide how to help. So I created what I called the Family Financial Assessment Project. I told each Richardson family member that David was considering using his inheritance to help family members in need, but that we wanted to make sure we were addressing the most urgent situations first. I asked each of them to provide detailed information about their financial situation, including assets, income, expenses, and debts. The responses were fascinating exercises in creative accounting and selective disclosure. Patricia and William submitted a financial statement that listed their monthly Social Security income, William's small pension, and their basic living expenses. They made no mention of the investment portfolio worth over $300,000 that I knew they possessed. They claimed to be living paycheck to paycheck on fixed retirement income. Michael provided documentation showing his modest salary from a part-time job and his expenses related to his landscaping business startup. He made no mention of the rental properties that were generating substantial monthly income. According to his financial statement, he was barely covering his family's basic needs. Jennifer submitted information about her family's expenses, her husband's teaching salary, and their children's educational costs. She made no mention of the trust fund she had inherited from her grandmother. Her financial picture showed a middle-class family struggling to save for their children's future. Every single family member had submitted fraudulent financial information, deliberately concealing assets and income, in order to appear needy and deserving of David's inheritance money. But I had done my homework. For each family member, I had prepared a comprehensive analysis of their actual financial situation, complete with property records, tax information, and investment documentation. I was ready to present evidence that would expose not just their current deception, but the pattern of financial manipulation that had defined our family relationships for decades. The family meeting I called for November 15, 2007 was ostensibly to discuss how David's inheritance could best be used to help family members in need. Everyone attended: Patricia and William, Michael and Sarah, Jennifer and Mark, and of course David and me. I had prepared presentation materials like I was giving a professional consulting report. Thank you all for providing your financial information, I began. David and I have been reviewing everyone's situations, and we want to make sure we understand the full picture before making any decisions about the inheritance. I started with what appeared to be a straightforward review of each family's submitted financial statements. I presented their claims neutrally, without comment, allowing each family member to nod along with their own version of their financial struggles. Then I revealed what I had discovered about their actual financial situations. However, I continued, I think there may be some information missing from these financial statements. For example, Patricia and William, you didn't mention the investment portfolio worth approximately $320,000 that generates about $1,500 in monthly dividend income. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia's face went white, and William started to stammer something about those investments being, quote, untouchable retirement funds. Michael, I continued, you didn't mention the 3 rental properties you own in Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, and Des Moines, which, according to county records, generate approximately $4,000 in monthly rental income. Michael's mouth fell open. Sarah looked at him in confusion, clearly unaware of the extent of their property holdings. And Jennifer, you didn't mention the trust fund you inherited from your maternal grandmother in 1998, which, according to probate records, was worth $108,000 and has been generating income for nearly 10 years. Jennifer actually gasped. Mark's eyes widened as he realized his wife had been hiding substantial wealth from him as well as from the family. But I wasn't finished. Most interesting of all, I said, turning to David, is that we've been funding all of these family emergencies and loans, while David has been sitting on a trust fund worth over $400,000 that he inherited when we got married but never mentioned to me. The explosion of shocked voices was immediate. Everyone started talking at once, offering explanations, justifications, and accusations. But I wasn't interested in their excuses. For 30 years, I said, raising my voice above the chaos, I have been contributing my earnings and my savings to support this family's financial needs. I have given or loaned approximately $150,000 to various family members for emergencies, business ventures, and lifestyle expenses. Not one penny of those loans has ever been repaid. I pulled out a detailed spreadsheet I had prepared. Every contribution is documented here. Michael's education loans, Jennifer's wedding expenses, Robert's failed business investments, Patricia and William's medical bills and home repairs. All funded by my income and savings, while every single one of you was sitting on substantial assets that you never revealed. The room was completely silent now. I could see the family members looking at each other, realizing that their decades-long deception had been completely exposed. But the most painful discovery, I continued, looking directly at David, is that my own husband has been coordinating with his family to manipulate me. I found the emails discussing my personality, my financial habits, and strategies for timing requests to maximize the likelihood that I would agree to give you money. David's face had gone completely pale. Maggie, I can explain. No, I interrupted. You can't explain 30 years of systematic deception. You can't explain pretending to be financially struggling while sitting on a fortune. You can't explain allowing me to sacrifice my financial security to support people who were wealthier than I was. I stood up and looked around the room at these people who had been taking advantage of me for decades. As of today, the family bank is permanently closed. David's inheritance money is his to do with as he pleases, but he'll be doing it without any input from me. And I want all of you to know that every penny I earn from this day forward will be going to cat shelters across the state of Iowa. The announcement hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't just about refusing to give them money in the future. This was about redirecting my wealth to organizations that would use it honestly and gratefully. Cat shelters? Patricia managed to stammer. Organizations that are genuinely struggling financially, I replied. Organizations that use donated money for its intended purpose. Organizations that don't manipulate donors or manufacture crises to extract sympathy and cash. As I walked out of that room, leaving behind a family that had exploited my generosity for 3 decades, I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth was finally out, and my money was finally going to go where it would do real good. The week following my revelation at the family meeting was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt like the emotional equivalent of surviving a natural disaster. Everything familiar had been destroyed, but the air was finally clear and I could see the landscape of my real life for the first time in decades. David's initial response was exactly what I might have expected from someone who had been caught in such an elaborate deception. He went through what I recognized as the classic stages of being exposed: denial, anger, bargaining, and eventually a kind of desperate damage control that was almost more insulting than the original lies. For the first 2 days, he tried to convince me that I had misunderstood the family's financial situations. "Those investments aren't liquid, Maggie," he said about his parents' portfolio. They can't just spend that money on daily expenses. When I pointed out that they had been collecting dividends from those investments for years, he shifted to arguing that Michael's rental properties were business assets that couldn't be considered personal wealth. When the denial phase failed, David moved into anger. He accused me of spying on his family, of violating their privacy, of being obsessive and paranoid about money. "You investigated my family like they were criminals," he said. "What kind of person does that to people they're supposed to love?" The irony of this accusation was staggering. David was angry at me for discovering the truth about his family's lies, but apparently felt no anger at his family for lying to me for 30 years. In his mind, my investigation was a violation of trust, but his participation in systematically deceiving me about our financial situation was somehow acceptable. The bargaining phase was the most pathetic. David tried to negotiate a middle ground where we could acknowledge that mistakes had been made but move forward together. He offered to be more transparent about his trust fund, to limit his family's requests for money, to give me more control over our financial decisions. He seemed to genuinely believe that the problem was poor communication rather than fundamental dishonesty and exploitation. "We can work through this," he kept saying. "Lots of couples have money problems. We just need to establish better boundaries with my family." But this wasn't a money problem that could be solved with better boundaries. This was a character problem that revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our values and our understanding of marriage. David's willingness to conspire with his family to manipulate me financially wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. It was a choice he had made repeatedly over decades. Meanwhile, the rest of the Richardson family was dealing with their own crisis management. Patricia called me several times, alternating between tearful apologies and indignant justifications. In one conversation, she would sob about how sorry she was that I felt deceived. In the next, she would argue that keeping family money private was normal, and that I was overreacting to standard family financial management. "We never meant to hurt you, Margaret," she said during one of these calls. "We just wanted to maintain our independence while still being able to help each other when needed." But their version of helping each other had always been unidirectional. They maintained their independence by keeping their wealth secret, while expecting me to sacrifice my independence by funding their lifestyle. Their definition of family mutual aid was that I gave and they received. Michael's response was perhaps the most honest, though not in a way that helped his case. When he called to explain his side of the story, he actually said, "Maggie, I never thought of it as taking advantage of you. You were so good at managing money and you seem to enjoy helping family. I figured you knew what you were doing." He had convinced himself that my financial contributions were evidence that I enjoyed being generous, rather than evidence that I was being emotionally manipulated into giving money I couldn't afford to lose. In his mind, my competence with money meant that my sacrifices weren't really sacrifices because I could afford them. Jennifer's reaction was the most complicated because she seemed to understand the ethical implications of what the family had done, but she was also desperate to maintain the relationships that this deception had poisoned. She wrote me a long letter explaining how guilty she felt about never mentioning her trust fund, but also describing how difficult it was to navigate family expectations about money. "I know what we did was wrong," she wrote, "but I also know that if I had told everyone about my grandmother's trust fund, I would have become the family bank instead of you. I was protecting myself the same way you were trying to protect yourself with your secret savings." This was probably the most insightful thing any Richardson family member said during the entire aftermath, but it also illustrated the fundamental toxicity of their family dynamics. Jennifer had allowed me to be exploited financially because she was afraid of being exploited herself. She had seen what was happening to me and chosen to protect herself rather than speak up about the unfairness of the situation. But while the Richardson family was processing their exposure and trying to manage the damage to their relationships, I was experiencing something completely different: freedom. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to worry about hiding money or protecting my savings from family requests. I didn't have to feel guilty about wanting to keep my earnings for my own security and future. I didn't have to participate in the elaborate theater of family financial crisis management. More importantly, I could finally use my money in ways that aligned with my values, rather than in ways that enabled other people's manipulation. My first major donation to cat shelters came in December 2007, just a month after the family confrontation. I gave $50,000 to 5 different organizations across Iowa, with instructions that the money should be used for veterinary care, food, and shelter improvements rather than administrative costs. The response from these organizations was everything I had hoped it would be. Each shelter sent detailed reports about how the money would be used. They provided photos of the cats who would benefit from better medical care and improved facilities. They invited me to visit and see the work being done firsthand. Most importantly, their gratitude was genuine and proportional. They understood that $50,000 was a significant donation that would make a real difference in their ability to help animals. They didn't take the donation for granted, they didn't immediately ask for more money, and they didn't seem to view me as a permanent source of funding for all their future needs. The contrast with the Richardson family's response to my financial contributions over the years was stark. These organizations appreciated what I had given them, used it efficiently for its intended purpose, and treated me with respect and gratitude. The Richardson family had taken my money for granted, used it for purposes I hadn't agreed to, and treated me like an ATM that should be available whenever they had financial wants. I started volunteering regularly at the Cedar Falls Cat Rescue, helping with their bookkeeping and financial planning. Working with people who were genuinely committed to helping vulnerable animals, using donated money carefully and transparently, felt like a moral cleansing after decades of enabling financial manipulation. The cats themselves provided a kind of therapy I hadn't expected. These were creatures who had been abandoned, neglected, or abused, but who were capable of recovering and thriving when given proper care and genuine love. Watching them learn to trust again, seeing them go from fearful and defensive to comfortable and affectionate, felt like a metaphor for my own healing process. David, meanwhile, was struggling to understand why I was so committed to directing my money toward animal welfare rather than reconciling with his family. "I get that you're angry," he said during one of our increasingly difficult conversations. "But don't you think you're taking this too far? Those cats don't need your money more than your own family does." But that was exactly the point he couldn't grasp. Those cats did need my money more than his family did, because his family had been lying about needing my money in the first place. The cats were genuinely vulnerable, genuinely dependent on the kindness of strangers, and genuinely grateful for help. His family was wealthy, manipulative, and entitled. By spring 2008, it had become clear that my marriage wasn't going to survive the aftermath of these revelations. David seemed to expect that eventually I would forgive his family's deception and return to some version of our previous relationship. He couldn't understand that the problem wasn't just the money they had taken, but the lies they had told and the manipulation they had used to take it. "They're still my family, Maggie," he would say. "I can't just cut them off forever because of this money stuff." Money stuff. 30 years of systematic financial exploitation had become money stuff, in David's mind. A minor disagreement that reasonable people should be able to work through. I realized that David fundamentally didn't understand what his family had done wrong. He saw their concealment of wealth as private family business rather than deliberate deception. He saw the requests for money as normal family mutual aid rather than manipulative exploitation. He saw my response as an overreaction, rather than appropriate self-protection. We separated in June 2008, and I moved into a small apartment near the animal shelter, where I had been volunteering. For the first time since I was 18 years old, I was living alone, supporting myself entirely, and making financial decisions based solely on my own values and priorities. The divorce proceedings were complicated by the fact that David had hidden assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars throughout our marriage. My attorney argued that this financial deception constituted fraud and grounds for me to claim a larger share of our marital assets. David's attorney argued that inherited money and family gifts weren't subject to marital property division. Ultimately, we reached a settlement that gave me approximately 60% of our combined known assets, plus a provision that any hidden assets discovered after the divorce would be split equally between us. Given that I had been the primary contributor to our marital savings, and that David had concealed significant wealth, this seemed fair. More importantly, the divorce gave me complete control over my financial future. David could continue funding his family's lifestyle with his trust fund and inheritance money if he chose to. I could direct my money toward organizations and causes that used it honestly and effectively. By the end of 2008, I had donated over $100,000 to various cat rescue organizations across the Midwest. I had also established a charitable foundation that would continue this work long after my death, ensuring that my lifetime savings would ultimately benefit animals rather than enriching people who had already proven themselves to be manipulative and dishonest. The work gave my life a sense of purpose and satisfaction that I had never experienced during my years of enabling the Richardson family's financial exploitation. Instead of funding someone else's wants and lies, I was addressing genuine needs and saving actual lives. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment again. For decades, I had allowed the Richardson family to convince me that my careful approach to money was selfish, that my desire for financial security was paranoid, and that my reluctance to give money freely was evidence of a character flaw. Now I understood that my instincts about money had been correct all along. Financial security was important. Protecting your savings from exploitation was necessary. Being careful about who you trust with your resources was wise rather than selfish. The Richardson family had tried to convince me that my money was family money, that belonged to everyone. But I had finally learned the truth. My money was my money, and I had every right to use it in ways that reflected my values rather than subsidizing other people's lies. 15 years have passed since I walked out of that Richardson family meeting and announced that my money would be going to cat shelters instead of continuing to fund their elaborate deceptions. Today, at 68, I can say with absolute certainty that it was the best financial decision I ever made. Not because of the money itself, but because of what that decision revealed about the kind of life I wanted to live and the kind of person I wanted to be. My apartment near the Cedar Falls cat rescue became more than just a place to live. It became the headquarters for what would grow into the largest private cat welfare foundation in Iowa. The Margaret Foundation for Feline Welfare has now donated over $847,000 to cat rescue organizations across the Midwest, funding veterinary care for thousands of abandoned and abused animals. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real transformation has been in my daily life and my understanding of what genuine relationships look like. Every morning, I wake up knowing that my money is being used exactly as I intend it to be used. When I write a check to a cat shelter, I know it will go toward veterinary bills, food, shelter improvements, and care for animals who desperately need help. No one is lying to me about how the money will be spent. No one is manufacturing fake emergencies to extract additional donations. No one is hiding their own resources while claiming they can't afford to help themselves. The contrast with 30 years of Richardson family financial dynamics couldn't be more stark. These animal welfare organizations operate with a level of transparency and gratitude that I never experienced with David's family. They send detailed reports about how donations are used. They invite donors to visit and see the work firsthand. They understand that charitable giving is a privilege that should be honored rather than an obligation that can be demanded. I've also discovered something that the Richardson family never offered me: a community of people who share my values about helping those who genuinely need help. Through my work with various cat rescue organizations, I've met dozens of volunteers and donors who dedicate their time and money to animal welfare because they believe it's the right thing to do, not because they expect anything in return. These are people who foster sick kittens in their own homes, who drive hours to transport animals to veterinary appointments, who spend their weekends cleaning litter boxes and socializing feral cats. Working alongside these people has taught me what authentic generosity looks like. It's not the performative kindness that the Richardson family demanded from me, where my financial contributions were taken for granted and immediately followed by requests for more. It's the quiet, consistent dedication of people who give what they can afford to give without expecting recognition or reciprocal benefits. I've also learned about the difference between enabling and helping. For 30 years, I enabled the Richardson family's financial irresponsibility by consistently bailing them out of situations they could have handled themselves if they had been willing to use their own resources. My contributions allowed them to maintain their comfortable lifestyles while avoiding the consequences of their poor financial decisions. But when I donate money to help a cat shelter expand their facility or cover emergency veterinary care, I'm not enabling dysfunction. I'm addressing genuine need that can't be met any other way. These animals can't earn money to pay for their own care. They can't make different choices that would improve their financial situation. They are completely dependent on human kindness for their survival and well-being. The work has also given me perspective on my own past behavior. I spent decades feeling guilty about wanting to keep my own money, wondering if I was being selfish for resisting my family's constant requests for financial help. Now I understand that protecting your resources from exploitation isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining your ability to help others in ways that actually matter. If I had continued funding the Richardson family's manufactured crises, I wouldn't have had the money available to make a real difference in animal welfare. My savings were finite, and every dollar that went to people who didn't actually need it was a dollar that couldn't go to creatures who desperately did need it. The Richardson family hasn't completely disappeared from my life, though our interactions are now limited and much more honest than they were during my marriage. David remarried in 2012 to a woman named Linda who, from what I hear through mutual acquaintances, seems much more willing to participate in the family's financial expectations. I suspect she either comes from a similar background where family financial manipulation is normalized, or she simply hasn't discovered the extent of the Richardson family wealth yet. Either way, it's no longer my concern. David has access to his trust fund and inheritance money, so presumably his family's financial needs are being met through his resources rather than requiring contributions from a working spouse. Michael's landscaping business eventually succeeded, though I suspect this had more to do with his rental property income providing financial stability than with any business acumen he developed. He's never attempted to repay any of the money I loaned him over the years, but he also hasn't asked for any additional funds since our family meeting in 2007. Jennifer divorced Mark in 2010, and I heard through the grapevine that the revelation of her hidden trust fund had been a significant factor in the breakdown of their marriage. Apparently, Mark felt betrayed by her financial secrecy in much the same way I had felt betrayed by the Richardson family's concealment of their wealth. There's some poetic justice in the fact that the dishonesty that enabled the family's exploitation of me eventually poisoned their own relationships with each other. Patricia and William both passed away within the past 5 years. Patricia in 2018 and William in 2020. I attended both funerals, not out of affection but out of respect for the decades I had spent as part of their family, even if that participation had been based on deception. At Patricia's funeral, several family members approached me to express their regret about how our relationships had ended, but their apologies still focused on my reaction to their behavior, rather than on the behavior itself. They were sorry that I had felt deceived, but they didn't seem to understand that the problem was the deception itself, not my emotional response to it. David actually approached me at William's funeral to suggest that perhaps enough time had passed for us to put this whole money thing behind us and rebuild some kind of relationship. He seemed genuinely puzzled when I told him that I wasn't interested in resuming contact with people who had systematically lied to me for 30 years. "But we're still family, Maggie," he said, using the same argument that had been used to justify taking my money for decades. "No," I replied, "we were family when I thought we shared the same values about honesty and mutual support. Once I discovered that you had been lying to me about fundamental aspects of our life together, we became strangers who used to be married." This seemed to be a distinction that David couldn't understand, but it was crucial for my own peace of mind. Family isn't just about blood relationships or legal connections. It's about trust, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The Richardson family had violated all of those foundations through their years of financial manipulation. These days, my real family consists of the community of people I've met through animal welfare work, the cats I've fostered over the years, and the shelter volunteers who have become close friends. These relationships are based on shared values and genuine mutual support rather than financial exploitation disguised as family loyalty. I currently have 3 cats of my own, all rescues from the shelter where I volunteer. Oscar is a 14-year-old orange tabby who was surrendered when his elderly owner moved to assisted living. Luna is a 5-year-old black cat who was found as a pregnant stray and gave birth to her kittens at the shelter. Whiskers is a 3-year-old gray and white cat who was abandoned at a veterinary clinic with a broken leg that required expensive surgery. These cats give me the kind of honest companionship that I never experienced with the Richardson family. They don't pretend to need things they don't actually need. They don't manipulate me emotionally to get access to resources. They appreciate what I provide for them without taking it for granted or immediately demanding more. Most importantly, they've taught me to trust my instincts about relationships. Cats are remarkably good judges of character, and they respond honestly to the energy people bring into their lives. Watching them learn to trust after being abandoned or mistreated has helped me understand my own process of learning to trust again after being manipulated for so long. As I look back on the past 15 years, I'm struck by how much happier and more fulfilled my life became once I stopped trying to maintain relationships based on financial obligation rather than genuine affection. The $847,000 I've donated to cat shelters represents far more than money. It represents my commitment to using my resources in ways that align with my values, rather than in ways that enable other people's dishonesty. Every dollar that went to help cats was a dollar that didn't go to fund the Richardson family's comfortable lifestyle while they lied about their financial situation. Every contribution to animal welfare was a choice to support honesty and genuine need rather than manipulation and manufactured crisis. I never married again after my divorce from David, but I don't feel like I'm missing anything essential from my life. I've learned that being alone with integrity is far preferable to being in relationships built on deception and exploitation. And I've learned that the phrase family money was always a lie designed to make me feel obligated to share resources with people who had no intention of reciprocating that generosity. My money was always my money, earned through my work and saved through my discipline. The only difference now is that I finally have the courage to use it in ways that make me proud, rather than in ways that make other people comfortable at my expense. To anyone watching this who might be facing similar manipulation from family members who want access to your hard-earned money, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about the financial dynamics in your relationships, it probably is wrong. You have every right to protect your resources and use them in ways that align with your values. Veal heliol peliol heliol kenas, madiol peliol 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 size. Your money, madiol size your money. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Madiol peliol peliol heliol kenais your mail tenas. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.